In this clip, we are going to take a look at a rare air-mobile operation called a paradrop. It may be rare, but it's an awful lot of fun. A paradrop can be conducted only once a game, and then only if a scenario specifies that it is possible. In a paradrop, all airborne units in an air-mobile formation can move onto the map during their air movement pulse by air transport, which enables them to parachute directly into their LZ hexes. There are 3 requirements to paradrop. 1. A unit must be an airborne unit type. We'll cover that shortly. 2. A unit must start the operation off-map. And 3. A unit must be assigned to an assault operation unless it is a base unit, meaning headquarters or artillery. So let's look at a Warsaw Pact air-mobile formation, in this case the 35th Air Assault Brigade, because it's about to conduct a paradrop. This formation is formed of 4 separate air-mobile battalions, each of which is treated like a separate regiment, meaning that each battalion must be assigned its own operation during the Warsaw Pact planning phase, and that operation may require a command point, and that each battalion moves and fights as if it were a separate regiment. The headquarters, which we see here all the way at the end on the left, behaves exactly like a Warsaw Pact Division main headquarters, except that it has no EW asset, it cannot make a fire call for a counter-battery fire strike, and it cannot decontaminate subordinate units. The reason that it can't do any of these 3 things is that it lacks the heavy equipment required for those functions when it drops in the field. The 2 leg infantry battalions that we see here on the right, the 1-1s, are composed of units that can only move by minimum movement, meaning that they can only move 1 hex a turn. They are termed leg infantry because they lack motorized transport. The other 2 BDM battalions, which are the 2-2s, are mechanized and they move normally. All of these units are airborne, meaning that they can paradrop, except for the 2 BMD battalions, the 2-2s, and the rocket artillery unit. The 2 BMD battalions and the rocket artillery unit can only enter the map using helicopter transport. Since only airborne units can participate in a paradrop, only the 2 leg infantry battalions, the 1-1s, and the headquarters will be able to enter the map via paradrop. However, the other units in the brigade can also enter the map in the same air movement pulse using any available helicopter transport. Note that an on-map airborne unit can never participate in a paradrop. They need to start at an air base far to the rear. So, in this example that we're looking at here, the Warsaw Pact player plans to enter the 35th Guards Air Assault Brigade this turn and to conduct a paradrop. He is therefore given his off-map airborne battalions, his 1-1s, assault operations, as well as one of his BMD battalions, his 2-2s, which he plans to bring in by helicopter transport since his 2-2s are not airborne. His last BMD battalion, since there are 2 of those, and he only has the helicopter transport for 1, will have to remain off the map and enter in a future turn when sufficient helicopter transport becomes available. At the start of the activation cycle for the 35th Guards, the Warsaw Pact player declares that he will be making a paradrop, which allows his airborne units to use air transport during their air movement pulse. He has also taken advantage of Special Rule 20.2.8, which allows the active player to expend RPs from an off-map airborne headquarters, plus any off-map RPs, to make reconnaissance attempts using any on-map maneuver unit as a spotter without regard to whether it is a subordinate unit or not, and without regard to command range, but only on the activation cycle when he first enters an air-mobile brigade. Essentially what this means is that the player is going to do the paradrop, gets the ability to do photo reconnaissance staging forward from anywhere along the front line, so he can use any unit as a spotter. In this case, one of these attempts has succeeded in acquiring the hex occupied by the division main HQ for the 12th Panzer here, which means that the Warsaw Pact player can make it the objective hex for an assault operation. During the operations segment of the 35th activation cycle, the Warsaw Pact player declares an assault operation, commits both of his leg airmobile battalions, his 1-1s, and the 1 BMD battalion that has an assault operation to this assault operation, and names the hex occupied by the 12th Panzer main HQ as his objective hex. Because he will be using air transport paradrop during the movement step of the assault operation, he must execute his air movement pulse first. Unlike helicopter transport, where he has a choice, when you do a paradrop, you always have to do your air movement pulse first and then your ground movement pulse second. So the Warsaw Pact player is now going to execute his paradrop, which means he consults case 29.5.1 and carefully follows the paradrop procedure that is outlined there. So we will now do that ourselves. The Warsaw Pact player first forms all of the units that will paradrop into single-step units. Here we're going to do this on the screen, but the Warsaw Pact player would really be doing this off-map. In this case, we will simply acknowledge the fact that these are one-step units by placing no step marker underneath the unit counters. Each of them then becomes a one-step unit. All right, so the next thing that happens is that the active player conducting the paradrop actually places the units that are paradropping into an LZ hex on the map, one battalion at a time. A unit can paradrop only into a clear or polder hex, and no unit can drop into the same LZ hex as another unit. Critically, no LZ hex can be adjacent to an enemy unit unless it is also adjacent to the objective hex. So if you're going to paradrop next to an enemy unit, you better also be adjacent to that objective hex. All right, so in this case, the Warsaw Pact player paradrops his first battalion into these three hexes. So he's going to drop here, and here, and here, limited to one company per hex. He then paradrops the second battalion into these three hexes. He has now ringed his objective hex. All right, the paradrop procedure then says that the enemy player gets to conduct flak fire against each paradropped unit as if it were an air unit conducting a strike in that hex. This means that the 12th Panzer HQ fires a flak fire combat at each one of these parachuting units, since it's the only NATO unit in range. There are 6 units to fire at, so the NATO player is going to roll 6 times, and in each case, his 12th Panzer only has a third of a flak point, which rounds down to 0, so only a 10 will hit. So the NATO player rolls around the clock, and he gets 7, 2, 5, 8, 4, and 10. Aha. All right, so flak fire hits this unit here. Any adverse result, so a hit check or abort, and a hit check and abort, any adverse result kills the target. Essentially, we're dropping a lumbering transport plane, and the parachutists in it all go down in flames. So that unit is eliminated by NATO's flak fire. Next, each paradrop unit must survive a disorganization die roll. So now this die roll, the first die roll, determines whether the transport planes were able to get through enemy flak fire and drop their parachutists, who were sometimes dropping from as low as 500 meters. The second roll looks at how scattered those paratroopers are and whether they can form up and how much of their equipment gets lost in trees and other things like this. So the disorganization roll now really asks the question, can these units form up after their paradrop into an effective unit? A result of 1 will eliminate the unit. So again, we're going to roll for each unit, and the Warsaw Pact player will be hoping for no 1s. So the Warsaw Pact player rolls again. 4, 8, 9, 2, 3. All right, so none of those were 1s. These units all survive their disorganization roll. This ends the paradrop. So these 2 battalions have now conducted their paradrop. However, we are still in the air movement pulse of the operation, which means that the 3rd battalion that was given an assault operation can now enter the map using helicopter transport. The Warsaw Pact player has 3 utility helicopters available, and so he will use these 3 utility helicopters to move the 3rd battalion and its BMDs. He has found a hole in the NATO line that allows him to slip through, and so he ultimately comes down here and drops right here. Note that he is staying out of the flak range of the 12th Panzer's HQ. So these units during the air movement pulse land in this LZ, and the utility helicopter speeds off the map back to the recovery box. With the air movement pulse concluded, we remove the remaining units in the brigade back off map because we have no more utility helicopter steps left with which to enter them. Play now proceeds to the ground movement pulse of the movement step. The Warsaw Pact player decides that he is going to move this infantry unit here. Now this brings up a special rule, which is that the 1-1 units in an air mobile formation that bear a unit symbol for paratroops, which is the little set of wings that we're looking at in the center of this unit. Any 1-1 with a paratroop unit symbol in an air mobile formation is automatically a leg infantry unit, meaning that there are no vehicles in this unit. This means that they don't get the normal movement allowance for an operation that any other type of unit does. Instead, they are allowed to move exactly 1 hex. They can move 1 hex into any type of terrain and across any type of hex site, with the sole exception of an unbridged major river hex site. But they can only move 1 step. So as an example, this unit here could actually legally move across this impassable slope because it's leg infantry and it can actually scale a cliff. But this infantry unit, for example, could not cross this unbridged main river hex site. So in the event the Warsaw Pact player chooses to move this unit here on top of its compatriot. Now, why is the Warsaw Pact player doing this? He needs to enable this BMD battalion to come down here because each one of these color stripes indicates a separate air mobile battalion, and Warsaw Pact air mobile battalions are treated just like regiments. One of the implications of that is that they need their own command point if they're going to conduct a reserve or offensive operation. Another is that when 2 different air mobile battalions stack, one of them is going to have to be masked. And so the Warsaw Pact player wants to get this unit out of the way so that when these units come down, they won't be masked in that hex. All right, so we actually execute this. The BMD battalion has the standard 3 movement points for an assault. So we go 1, 2 next to the objective hex. And that concludes the ground movement pulse and therefore the movement step of this entire operation. The next step in the operation would normally be jamming. However, there is no headquarters for the 35th Guards on the map, and were it on the map, it does not possess an EW asset because that equipment's too heavy for air mobile operations, so there is no jamming step. We proceed directly to the defensive fire call step. The headquarters here has no attack strength of its own, but it is still perfectly capable of making a fire call on its own behalf to this FH-70 unit here. And so the NATO player does make that fire call. This unit has 3 steps, and per the rules for defensive fire, the NATO player could split those 3 steps and make 3 separate defensive fire combats against 3 individual target hexes. So he could, for instance, attack this hex, and this hex, each with the fire strength of 1 step. However, the NATO player determines that it is this BMD stack here that's really the threat. And so he makes a fire call to the FH-70 unit, and he allocates all of its fire to a single fire combat against that target hex. So this unit has a total fire strength of 9. That becomes a 4 after the standard division by 2. The NATO player rolls a 6, which adds no hit modifier, so we have a straight 4 hits inflicted here. The Warsaw Pact player chooses to absorb 2 of those hits by killing this 1-step BMD unit. He absorbs the second 2 by killing a second BMD unit. So these 2 units are eliminated, and that concludes NATO's defensive fire. The Warsaw Pact player now has a chance to fire back. The 2 units on the opposite side of the mine are halved for firing across a major river. So collectively, they represent 1 attack strength, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have a grand total of 6. Standard division by 2 drops that to 3. The Warsaw Pact player rolls a 5, and again, we have no hit modifier, so this is a straight 3 hits. The headquarters has a natural defense strength 1 plus 1 for being in the town, so its adjusted defense strength is 2. The NATO player elects to retreat, which absorbs 2 hits, allowing it to ignore the 3rd hit. During the retreat step of the operation, the NATO player retreats into this hex. Normally not allowed across a major river, except for the fact that we actually have a bridge here. So that exposes this retreating unit to retreat fire in this hex, because both of these units have a ZOC into it. Because the hex is clear terrain, this retreat fire is doubled. So the raw combat power of 2 becomes a 4 for the retreat fire into a clear terrain hex. 4 is back down to 2 by the standard division by 2. So we're firing with 2. We roll the die. We roll a 4. That's a -1. So the 2 becomes 1, but the defense strength of this headquarters in a clear terrain hex is just 1, and it cannot retreat from retreat fire. So that is plenty sufficient to eliminate the unit. During the advance step of the operation, the Warsaw Pact player cannot advance these 2 units across the unbridged major river hex sides that separate them from the objective hex, so they remain where they are. But all of the other units are allowed to advance in, and the Warsaw Pact player chooses to do that. That is going to mask somebody, so the Warsaw Pact player chooses to mask this unit and leave the other air mobile battalion as the legal possessor of that hex. And that concludes the operation. It is worth noting that the Warsaw Pact player would not have had to have done this the way I just did. It is possible that he could have entered each one of these air mobile battalions in an independent operation, each one of which could have then tried to take the hex here in Zellingen. So there is no requirement to combine all these assault operations into one operation. The Warsaw Pact player could have launched 3 separate assault operations. To complete the activation cycle for the 35th Guards Air Assault Brigade, the Warsaw Pact player declares a march operation for the brigade base units, and during the air movement pulse of this march operation, he can paradrop in his airborne brigade HQ, which is an airborne unit and therefore capable of doing this. So the Warsaw Pact player drops his headquarters, and because there is now no flak within range, the Warsaw Pact player is eligible to drop his headquarters into this clear terrain hex. He must still roll for disorganization. He rolls a 2. Whew, okay, he does not die from the disorganization die roll. So that concludes the air movement pulse for the march operation. He couldn't bring in the other unit in the brigade base, which is the BM-21 rocket artillery unit, because that unit is not an airborne unit. It's only air mobile, and he has no utility helicopter steps left to bring it in. So at the end of the air movement pulse, he conducts his ground movement pulse, and this unit joins the rest of the brigade in the town. And it is flipped to its use side. So that concludes the activation cycle for the 35th Guards Air Assault Brigade, and with it, this clip.